It is a tremendous honor for me to welcome Mr. Tom Campbell.
Sorry we've gotten off to a bit of a late start, but we had more people than we thought, and they just kept coming, and hopefully everybody's got a seat or someplace they're going to be able to be comfortable for approximately 3 hours. We will take a break somewhere in the middle. This is primarily not to be me lecturing you. This is primarily to be a question and answer. So hopefully you will have lots of questions. But I will start it with a little bit of background, a little bit of a summary of who I am and how I ended up, I should say this way, how a nice physicist like me ended up, in a place of studying consciousness and publishing books on consciousness. That's not a pairing that often happens. So that's sort of a unique position that I'm in. I started my career, if you'll say, in physics and in conscious research at about the same time, early 1970s. I was 20-something, just out of graduate school, and my first job as a professional physicist, my boss showed me a book, Journeys Out of the Body by Bob Monroe, and he asked me what I thought about it. And I read the book, and when your boss asks you what you think about it, you got to be careful how you answer. So I read it, and what I told him was that it sure was interesting, and if it was true, that was exciting because it would mean that there was another whole set of reality that I didn't know much about. But that, how do you know if it's true? How do you know that he's not just making up stories? How do you know it's not just to sell books? How do you know he didn't just dream this all up? So that's kind of where we rested. My boss kind of agreed with that. Yeah, it really was interesting, but how do you know? Well, it wasn't more than a couple of months after that my boss found where Bob Monroe lived. It was only about 45-minute drive from where we lived. So we made an arrangement to go see Bob Monroe. I don't know if you know Bob Monroe, but he wrote not only Journeys Out of the Body, but then he wrote Far Journeys and then Ultimate Journeys. Those are probably published in 30 different languages. They're, come on in.
Bring your own chair.
Bring your own chair, yeah. It's your challenge is to find a place to put it. You can just put it right over here if you want. That's fine. Okay. So it's a well-known book. It's been read by many hundreds of thousands of people. And when I met Bob, I realized he wasn't writing that book because he wanted to make money. When you got to his manor house, it was the big house on the hill where you do about a half-a-mile run along the whiteboard fence with the horses inside to follow along the car on the other side of the fence. About 500 acres of prime Virginia mountains and farmland. So he wasn't making these books for money. He was already a very wealthy man. And I found out that what he wanted to do is study consciousness. That was his ambition. He wanted to make his out-of-body experiences real. He wanted to make it science. So he had set up a lab and was looking for a couple of scientists to help him turn his experience into science. And there I happened to be sitting on his doorstep at that time. So myself and another fellow from where I worked, Dennis Menerick, we agreed. And we said, Bob, we will be your scientists, no charge, if you teach us what you know about out-of-body. If you can teach us to have these experiences. And that was our deal because we knew that if we didn't experience it, it wouldn't be real to us. You can study somebody else, but it's just studying somebody else. And you never really know what they mean or how seriously you ought to take it because it's somebody else. So he agreed. And for the next probably 7 or 8 years, Dennis and I spent 15 to 20 hours a week with Bob Monroe in his lab. And within probably the first 6 months or a year, he was successful at teaching us how to do what he did. So we learned to, on demand, whenever we wanted to, go out of body. Now, first I have to tell you, out of body is a very poor term. You're not in your body, and it's not something that goes out of your body. That's a mistaken metaphor. It's becoming aware, conscious and operative within consciousness. This is exploration of inner space, as opposed to the exploration of outer space that we spend billions of dollars on. This exploration of inner space is free, except for the time that it costs you and the effort that it costs you. So it was about the exploration of inner space, about exploring consciousness. Probably 100 years ago, people studied this phenomena, and they called it astral projection, because they believed they projected their soul out of their body into an astral plane. But these were all beliefs and metaphors. Bob is the one that made up the out-of-body experience, and OOBE, O-O-B-E, because he didn't like all the emotional and theoretical stuff that went along with astral projection, so he made up his own term so he didn't have to be associated with that. So anyway, I learned to do that, and as a physicist, my goal in life, what I do, is that I try to understand reality, how it works. Why does it work that way? What can you do in this world of consciousness? What can't you do there? What are the limits, and why are there limits? What are the limits from? So that was what my mission was. And I was the only physicist on the team. Dennis was an electrical engineer. So I wanted to understand the theory behind it. Why did it work? Took me a long time. I'm a slow learner. Took me a very long time. But I was able to figure it out because I was able to do experiments in the non-physical. Once you can leave this reality frame, go into that consciousness reality, that out-of-body reality, if we continue to use that term. When you can do that at will and do it many, many hundreds and hundreds of times, you get to where you can repeat your experiences very precisely. In other words, you can get into the same altered state in exactly the same way with the exactly same kind of entrance, same kind of attitude, same sort of everything, so that you can actually do science there. You can hold all the variables still except one. So you repeat it the same way and you let one variable be loose. And then you change that variable and see how does it change your result. And then you change it again and see how does it change your result. And you do that 100 times until you have some idea what this variable has to do with this system and how the system works and what its limitations are. So I did that, and it took me another 35 years before I thought I understood it well enough to write it down. Somebody challenged me, and I'd been talking about it, and somebody challenged me, says, well, how does all this work? What's the big picture here? And I had a lot of pieces of it, but I didn't really have a good overall theory yet. So I decided that I'd write it down, because I found that you can think in your mind, you think you understand something, but some of your thinking can be pretty fuzzy. Sometimes you have these assumptions inside and you just kind of slide over them without really being too critical, and that when you write it down, it forces you to clarity. It forces you to say exactly what you mean and mean exactly what you say, when in casual conversation, we tend to be kind of fuzzy in our concepts and in the things we say. So that was the beginning of the book, and eventually I said, wow, maybe I'll have enough for a book. And then it was, wow, I've got way too much for a book. And then I decided that making a book that thick, with 900 pages in it probably wasn't going to be a winner, so I broke it into 3 volumes, and that's the trilogy, the My Big Toe Trilogy. But I learned a lot while I was writing the books, and the theory began to gel and make more and more sense to me as I put it down on paper and had to force myself to think very logically about it. And I wanted these books to be an exercise in logic, not an exercise in intuition. And that's because there's thousands of books out there that talk about the larger reality in terms of poetry, in terms of personal experience, like Bob's, in terms of personal experience, in terms of metaphors. And poetry has to be interpreted. That's the problem. Poetry is wonderful, and it says a lot in a short bit, but it has to be interpreted. So don't be bashful. Come on in. Just walk in. Find some place to sit. Yeah. There's some, you can put some chairs right up here if you like, or there's some seats on the stairs.
Everybody okay?
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. Yeah, poetry has to be interpreted. And that's the problem, because people like me, scientists and lawyers and doctors and Indian chiefs and people who spend their lives with logical process can't read poetry and come up with something that we really put a lot of credibility in, because it's kind of wishy-washy. It could be interpreted dozens of ways, and we want to know what's the right way, otherwise we can't go down that path. So there was lots of on-ramps to the larger reality. Let's just call it that now. You could call it spirituality or lots of other things, but there was to consciousness experience. Lots of on-ramps, but none of them were scientific and none of them were logical, and I wanted mine to be that way because that's the way I am. It's the way I think. So it took me a while to write this and understand it. Those books are now, if you don't, I know some of you are very new to this, but those books are available on Google Books for free, and they have been since the day they were published. So they always have been on Google Books for free. What's on Google Books, though, is the very first edition, as soon as it was published, and that hasn't changed any. So it's the older first edition. Since then, I've made lots of little changes and fixed an error here and changed an is to an R and an R to an is, done that kind of thing, which makes it a little easier to read. But I've also added a little bit of science, more than I had in it before, because I knew from my own experience and the things that I could do, the things that should have been impossible. People call these the paranormal things, the things that don't have any physical explanation, normal physical explanation. That's why they're paranormal, they're outside of normal. I realized that consciousness was fundamental. Consciousness was at the core, and that this physical reality was a product of consciousness, had to be a creation of consciousness. But at the time I finished the book and published it, I didn't really know exactly how that worked. It was still a bit of a mystery, although I knew that that's the way it had to be. I'd had it out for about two and a half years when the person was asking me questions about another subject altogether, and in my mind a bell rang. The proverbial aha moment came about, and I realized that the very same principles and ideas that was my theory of consciousness, and that's really what this MBT was. My Big Toe really was a theory of consciousness more than anything else. I realized that that theory of consciousness could explain quantum mechanics in a logical, straightforward way that made it logical science, not weird science. And that was a big aha for me. I should have gotten that a lot early. I'm pretty dense. I'm a physicist. If anybody can make that connection, I should have made it, and I should have made it earlier. But it wasn't obvious to me. It didn't jump out until I got this trigger that made it obvious. So then my thought was, well, if I can explain quantum mechanics logically, then what about the other big part of modern physics, and that's relativity? So I thought about that, and it only took me about a day before, maybe even less, just a few hours, and that fell into place. You see, relativity is based on the speed of light being a constant. And if you have that as an assumption going on, the speed of light is a constant, then you get special relativity with just a little algebra. It's not even advanced math. Just based on that one fact. And then once you have special relativity, you do some geometry and you get general relativity, which then includes gravity in the situation. So relativity is just based on C being a constant. And as it turned out, my work explained why C indeed had to be a constant. Couldn't be anything else. So now I really felt like I was on a roll, right? It's don't quit while you're hot. So I started looking at all the other paradoxes in physics. There's lots of them, lots of paradoxes. Just the simple fact of tunneling, where particles should be trapped, and there's no physical way they should be able to get out because the energy to get out is much smaller than the energy that's holding them in. But they get out anyway. It's called tunneling. You find particles that ought to be in a box elsewhere. Magically, they seem to teleport out of the box to someplace else. That's been around for 60, 70 years. We have electronic components called tunneling diodes that depend on it. They run in this electronic equipment we have. So it's not just an esoteric thing, it's a thing that we use all the time, this tunneling effect. The troublesome problem of where did that ball of plasma come from, that's the beginning of Big Bang Theory. Big Bang Theory says that you start with a ball of plasma, very high temperature, very high pressure, and at T equals 0, you let it expand. And as it expands, it cools, it forms suns, planets, and you end up with a universe. So that's the evolution of the universe, starting with a ball of plasma. But where did the ball of plasma come from? You see, science has this attitude that our physical reality is all the reality there is. Well, if that's the case, our physical reality didn't exist yet. So how did where it come from, exist from it when it hadn't started yet? So there's a problem there. Where did that ball of plasma come from? Well, my theory of consciousness explained that as well. So I went through all of these paradoxes in physics, and they all fell out, one right after the other. I had a logical explanation for them, just from the same principles that described consciousness, much of which I had derived from my experiments inside of consciousness, or as you might say, in an out-of-body state, but doing experiments there in that state. So that's kind of why a physicist ends up talking about consciousness, because it makes a difference. It makes a big difference. And I would never have figured out this theory and this physics if I hadn't been able to do the experiments in consciousness. That was a key part of it. As you see, I had lots of data points I had to fit. If you have a theory of everything, that's a theory that explains everything. All the data points, all the facts in the world, all the things that experiments have verified. You have to have a theory that can explain every one of those facts. That's what I mean by all the points. All the data points have to be explained. And if you can't explain some, and they're facts, then your theory is incomplete. And it needs to be changed or thrown out or redone. So I had a lot more points to cover than most physicists, because I had all these facts that I had generated in my study of consciousness that had to be explained, as well as all the things that I knew from physics in the physical world that had to be explained, plus all the things that maybe weren't facts, but were very solid concepts and ideas that were in the metaphysical world, things that people had known and were obvious. things that people had experienced for years and years, things that that science had worked around the edges of, but didn't really understand. And a lot of those were things we call paranormal. Okay. Duke University, previous to my writing a book, had been working on it for like 10 years. They had a lot of data on things paranormal, and they realized that it is a fact, it exists. So I took those kinds of things in as facts as well, and to see which ones I could explain and which ones I couldn't explain. So I ended up with this theory of everything, and any theory has to be alive. It can't be, this is it, you know, there's nothing else, this is the whole thing. If you do that, then that's a belief, and you cut yourself off from ever learning anything else. So every theory has to be one that can be modified, can be changed. It has to be a living thing, so that when new data comes in that can't be, you know, that isn't explained, then either the theory does it or the theory is incomplete. So I'm constantly looking out for new data points, facts that don't have an explanation. And so far I have been able to explain all the facts I've been able to come up with. So far it holds, but I doubt that it will hold forever. I mean, it's a theory. New things will come up and there'll be new ways of looking at things, and you'll have to add something to it or maybe take something away from it or change something. That's just the way science is. Science evolves. This idea that, okay, I've got it right and it'll be this way forever, it's not a theory, it's a law. That is not the way we think anymore in science. Newton was the last one to declare laws, and of course all his laws turned out to be approximations. None of them are laws. None of them are exactly the way he says. They don't work that way. They're just approximations in certain ranges of reality. When things move relatively slowly, you know, when they're big things, when they're in the macro world, then they work pretty well. But if you really want to get into the details, they're wrong. They're not really right. So that's kind of an introduction to who I am, how I got here, and what I'm talking about. Now, one interesting thing that I should point out is physics is kind of boring, right, to most people. If you're not a physicist, it's like, oh, really, physics? We're going to listen to that for 3 hours? No, I wouldn't put you through that. But there are some things here, besides the explanation of many of the things that used to be called paranormal. Now, they're just normal, actually, from this point of view. They're not paranormal at all. One thing that's really interesting here is that my theory is based upon consciousness being an information system. And that makes sense intuitively, because what is our conscious? What are we conscious of? Well, it's what we get with our 5 senses. And what is that? It's information, right? A photon bounces off of me and goes into your, you know, lens, which focuses on your retina, which creates a little voltage pulse. Gets some electrons moving. Well, that's just data. That's information. Not only that, it's discrete information. Photons are discrete. Little pulses of, you know, of electricity are discrete. So it's digital information. Digital meaning discrete chunks, not continuous. Okay. So consciousness is a digital information system. It's all about information. And 15 years ago, when these books first came out, myself and maybe 2 or 3 other people thought the idea that our reality was based on information, you know, 2 or 3 of us thought that was a good idea, really made sense, and everybody else thought we were crazy, that was ridiculous. Because when you base a reality on information, that's called a virtual reality, a computed reality. They're all one and the same thing. So say, hey, this is a virtual reality, just like those games you play. You know, this body's just your avatar, and you're a piece of consciousness. That's like, what? You got to be kidding. Well, 15 years ago, that wasn't taken seriously. Today, I'd say every physics department on the planet has probably, you know, 20, 30% of people who think virtual reality is really a good idea. And it's not because it's becoming a fad, it's because understanding this reality as information-based is the only thing that allows physicists to get right answers. If they assume that it's mass-based, you know, particle-based, they can't get the right answers. But if they assume that it's information-based, then it suddenly makes sense. So physicists are being drugged kicking and screaming to this idea that this is a virtual reality. They don't like that. And the whole reason they don't like it is the reason that I like it a whole lot. And that probably most of you will like it a whole lot. Okay, here's the way the logic goes. If this is a virtual reality, then there's a few logical things we can say about it. Things that are true of all virtual realities. Any virtual reality has these properties. One property is that the computer that computes the virtual reality can't reside inside the virtual reality. Right? Think about that. If you're playing World of Warcraft, the computer that's generating World of Warcraft can't be a part of the World of Warcraft game. The computer that generates it has to be in another reality outside of that game because it's creating the game, right? So it can't be created from inside. Now, another thing is that a virtual character that's going to play in this virtual reality, we call them avatars, okay? That avatar is just a computed thing. It's ones and zeros on a hard drive someplace. It's a dynamic game. Those ones and zeros are constantly changing, but that's all it is. It's just information on a hard drive. Okay? Information on a hard drive doesn't make choices. Information on a hard drive isn't conscious. Information on a hard drive is just a bunch of ones and zeros stuck in storage somewhere. Just like your Word document. Your Word document isn't conscious for the same reason. It's a bunch of ones and zeros stuck on a hard drive someplace. So that tells you that the consciousness that is making the choices for that avatar has to also be outside the virtual reality. It can't just be part of the ones and zeros. Okay. Now that makes sense in that think about World of Warcraft or Sims or some other virtual reality game you play. The player is the consciousness for the avatar. The player makes all the avatar's choices. The player says, elf, run, elf, fight, elf, jump, elf, dance, whatever he wants his elf to do, the player has to make that choice, and the player then sends a message to the computer and says, I want my elf to jump. The computer then changes the ones and zeros, it gives you a picture of an elf jumping. Okay? And all the consequences of that elf jumping based on other players and the things they're doing and the environment and so on. Okay? That's the way the game's played. So the player is the consciousness. The player can't be inside the game. If you're inside the game's where the virtual things are. So the player has to be also in another reality frame relative to the virtual reality. Can't be inside the virtual, it has to be outside the virtual reality. The player has to be in the same reality as the computer because the player and the computer are sending data back and forth. That's what virtual reality is all about. It's really a stream of data going between a player and a computer. So they have to be in the same reality. So what does that tell us about us? We have physical bodies that are avatars. The computer and the player, our consciousness, is non-physical to us. It has to be some other reality outside of this virtual reality that we're playing in. So that's just a fact of virtual reality. You can't have a virtual reality and not have that being the case. It's the nature of virtual reality. So that brings us to the point then of these 20-30% of these physicists think virtual reality is a good idea. All the experiments they're doing these days in quantum mechanics say this is an information-based reality. This is a virtual reality. What's that saying? That's saying that the scientists are coming to the conclusion that our physical world is a subset of something bigger, something more fundamental, and that something that's bigger and more fundamental is non-physical to us from our perspective from inside the virtual reality. Well, that's kind of a big statement, you see. So now we have physics that's spilling out over into philosophy and metaphysics and all sorts of things with very powerful statement about the nature of reality. That's significant. So it's not just physics, but it's saying something that's pretty strong, that will make a lot of difference. Because you see, in the old days, the high priests were religious people. Today, the high priests are the scientists. High priests are the people that tell everybody else what to believe and what's true and what isn't. So the scientists say, oh, that's not true, this is true. Everybody nods and goes, uh-huh, because we believe those scientists wouldn't say that if it wasn't true, because they're scientists. We believe them, just like they used to believe the priests wouldn't say that if it wasn't true, because they're priests. So scientists are the high priests of Western culture. And when the high priests stand up and say, yea, verily, there is something more fundamental than us, and we're a subset of it. It's more fundamental than us, and it's non-physical. That's going to be really a strange day when the scientists stay up and say that, isn't it? Because there's a couple of more logical pieces that I can attach to that make it even more powerful. The second piece is that because what animates a character isn't the physical stuff, it's not the action, it's not the environment. What animates the character is the character's choices, right? It's the character's choices is what makes the character do what it does. Those choices are consciousness. So that tells you who the player is. The player's consciousness. That tells you who the computer is. The computer is consciousness. So the player and the computer are all part of this same larger consciousness system. It's all consciousness. So we have a subset of this larger conscious system that serves as a computer, a subset of this larger conscious system that serves as what I call individuated units of consciousness. That would be us, the players. Basically, pieces of that larger conscious system that it created to help it evolve. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about that evolution, and then we're going to open it up for questions. I have one point I'm getting at here that I'd like to make first, because it'll create a lot of questions. So I'll make sure we won't run out. Okay, so if you're following with me so far, we have consciousness as a information system that's digital, and we have us, the players, as pieces of that consciousness, right? That are part of digital consciousness, and we have our bodies and our universe and our world as a virtual reality. Okay, now the question is, well, why? What is this about? Well, given that our reality is really information-based, and that information is really the only thing that's real, if you didn't have your five senses, what would you be? You'd be a point of consciousness floating in a black void. That's all you'd be. The Descartes moment, right? I think, therefore I am. I am, therefore I think. You see, I exist, therefore I'm conscious. So that's all you'd have, nothing more than that. So our world, our reality is created from data, from information. So this information system, like all information systems, has to evolve and grow by lowering its entropy. Now, entropy is a physics word. It's just simply a measure of disorder. High entropy, lots of disorder. Low entropy, little disorder. Okay, now, an information system is made up of bits. A bit is just a name for the smallest unit of information. Now, in our computer processes, that's a 1 and a 0. Okay, we call it a binary bit. But bits don't have to be binary. That's just probably the bottom level of the way you can do things. So we can think of it now just as 1s and 0s. That's bit. Well, if you have a system of information and all those bits, every bit it has is random, then there is no information, right? Random bits don't contain any information. They don't mean anything because they're random. That's the definition of random. So how does an information system evolve? How does it exist? It exists by creating order out of disorder, by creating content. Content and meaning is just order and structure. Okay? Any kind of order produces information. even just simple little orders. And here's a little example. Up, down, up, down, up, down. What's next? Up. How'd you know that? Because the pattern carries information. See? It's a structure. It carries information. So information systems evolve by decreasing the entropy of the system. Creating order in an information system means creating information. Constructing, building. And that information needs to be valuable, needs to mean something, needs to be useful. Okay. Just a bunch of random structures are a little lower entropy, but it doesn't evolve you very much. So you have to have meaningful structures, content, significance. That's what a system wants to create. So here's an information system, and if it can evolve itself, it's getting more and more order, more and more information. As it de-evolves, it's getting less. It's getting more randomness, less information. So if this information system is conscious, it's a matter of life or death. If the information system becomes totally random, then it dies. It doesn't have any information anymore. So it wants to continue on, building. It's aware. It's consciousness. Okay, so I'm starting now with an assumption. The assumption is consciousness exists. Simple assumption. Not a real wild one because we all think, we're conscious. So it seems like that's be a good place to start, that consciousness exists. So it evolved by creating patterns of patterns, and it got kind of bogged down after a while. It got all the kind of patterns it could think about, and patterns of the patterns, and it came up with a new technology. And the new technology was called time. Now, it had always had time in a kind of a primordial sense, because you can't have order at a time without the time, because it was before the order and after the order. You change something. There's always a before and after, which requires time. So there's always some sort of time there. That's another assumption. Okay. Now, what it did is simply took two of those bits, a 1 and a 0, and just alternated them. 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, and it just built a metronome. That's a clock. So now it had a clock. So with clock, that's the new technology. Now it can have sequences of patterns. Now you got a whole new dimension in which it could create and produce order, because it could produce both order, in time as well as the order it was producing. So it also worked that out until that kind of got stalled. Like all of these inventions, it kind of creates new things you can do, more order, more ways that you can organize things. Okay, but eventually you kind of work out that, and it needed to do something else to help it continue to evolve. And like other systems that we know of, it did the exact same thing that other systems do when they run into the same problem. What it did is it created pieces of itself that it could interact with, because it was a monolithic thing trying to evolve. It had only a certain limited number of possibilities to evolve into, certain ways that it could organize. But if it had another thing like itself that also had free will, and I've just introduced free will, okay, then who knows what would happen out of that? Now you got two things that are independent, that can interact with each other. A whole bunch of new possibilities arise. Well, if it's that way with two, what about if there were 1 million and they were all interacting with each other? Wow, think of all the possibilities you could have with all of that interaction. How many ways could that go together? What are the combinations and permutations of possibilities among millions of things with free will? It's pretty much unlimited, you see. So now it had room to evolve into. And we are one of those individuated units of consciousness, one of those pieces. and we have free will. So free will, consciousness, time, all go together. They're all logically necessary for each other. You see, consciousness does what? It has awareness, but it makes choices. That's what consciousness does. It makes choices. Well, if you make a choice, you have to have time because it's before you made the choice and after you made the choice, so time's necessary. And you need free will because otherwise there is no choice. Free will says that there is a choice. Determinism says there is no choice. So consciousness, free will, and time all kind of go together as a group of things that are necessarily logical for each other to exist. And down on the other side of that, in the opposite corner, is where most science is today, and that is there is no time. Time is an illusion. There is no consciousness. There is no free will. You have determinism instead of free will. And if you are a materialist, you have to be in that camp. Materialism cannot exist as a concept without determinism. It also comes to the conclusion that there is no time. Time has to be an illusion, and there is no free will. There is no choice. Everything's a big machine. Materialism has our reality is just this big machine. If you knew where all the piece parts were, and you knew what state they were all in, their velocity, their size, all the things about all the parts, then you could calculate everything that would ever happen from there on, because it's just this machine that obeys the rules. You can't have free will. Nobody's making any choices. Everything happens because it's just the way the machine works. So, you see, determinism means that you have to have determinism if you have a machine. And time becomes a problem in a machine as well. And that gets more into relativity theory, but time does become a problem in this machine because everything that's possible to happen needs to happen. And I guess that turns into many worlds theory, which we'll maybe get into later if you want to talk about it. So we have these two opposite ends, the free will, the consciousness, and the time, no free will, no consciousness. Okay, so scientists would tell you that there's only the illusion of consciousness, the illusion of time, and the illusion of free will. They're all illusions. And the reason why they say that is because they're materialists. And any other answer would wreck materialism. So they don't say that because it makes sense. None of those things make sense. We're conscious. There is no consciousness. It's just an illusion. There is no time. Well, we recognize time. We recognize choice. We recognize consciousness every day in our life. So to deny that any of them exist takes a lot of gall, I guess. It takes a lot of belief to say things like that. But you have to if you're going to see this as a material world, see the world as a machine. All right, so my thought is that when the scientists finally get the virtual reality thing and the 20% grows to 80%, and most everybody's on board with that because it's the only thing that works, then somebody's going to ask, well, where's this virtual reality come from? Okay, we're part of a virtual reality, and there's somewhere it has to be computed, and somewhere, you have to have the consciousness that runs it, and where is that stuff? And of course, it's all non-physical. And it's only logical that the computer is consciousness. So consciousness is the computer. That's the answer to that one. Consciousness is the player. But what that tells us is one last logical point about this virtual reality. Consciousness now is a social system. In this virtual reality, you have a whole bunch of individuated units of consciousness are playing this game together. It's a social system. And even if they're not logged into this virtual reality, consciousness just interact. They swap data. That's all they do. They communicate. They make choices. That's it. That's the function of consciousness, is as the choice maker. How do you optimize being for an information system, how do you lower the entropy? How do you evolve the system if it's a social system? Now we've got these millions of individuated units of consciousness. Well, look at all the ways that social systems can interact with each other, and there's two primary paths that you can take. One of them lowers entropy, which means the system evolves and lives. The other one increases entropy, which means the system is de-evolving, moving toward death. Okay. These two systems, well, maybe I'll give you a little example. Here's an example. Let's take individuated units of consciousness. We'll take 10,000 of them and we'll put them in here in group A. Another 10,000, we'll put them here in group B. They're all basically the same. One group exactly like the other one as far as their capabilities, what they know, what they don't know, and we're going to give each group identical resources. And then we're just going to let them interact, and let them go and see where they go. Okay, and you'll have the one group I'll call the love group. The other I'll call the fear group, because that's the fundamental ethic that they have. Okay, in the love group, they care about other, not about themselves. So in that group, they have resources, certain numbers of individuals. They need, what they will do is that they will try to optimize it for everybody. Because that's the love group. They care about other. They're not going to optimize it for themselves. They're going to try to optimize it for everybody. Well, everybody's trying to optimize it for everybody else. That means if you come up with a really good idea, some invention, you tell everybody, you share it, because everybody can use it. If you, find some resource that you didn't know, that you just discovered, you share it with everybody, because everybody can use it. You see, you help each other. You know, this guy's barn burns down, everybody's neighbors come together and help him build it back up. That's the kind of world you have. It's an interactive, everybody trying to be helpful to everybody else. That's what love is about. It's about other. On the fear side, well, if you have fear, you don't have trust. You can't trust, if you have fear, because you fear that person that you trust is going to stab you in the back. They're not worthy of your trust. So there's no trust on this side. And what happens is that everybody's out for themselves. So everybody grabs as much as they can grab, and they try to hold on to it. Holding on to it's a problem. Those other ones will grab everything they can grab, and then they'll come and take yours. So the big problem is, how do you hold on to it? Well, you hold on to it by being bigger or better than those other people, so it's very competitive. You hold on to it by forming groups up. Okay, here's a self-protection group. We're going to all group together and we're going to protect each other's stuff. It's still all about us, but we are going to cooperate just as a protection group. So now we can go out and take other people's stuff, because there's 10 of us and the rest of them haven't figured this out yet. So we can take everybody else's stuff, you see, and make them part of our group maybe. And if they don't want to be part of our group, we can just do away with them. We don't need them. So eventually what happens is, in this fear group, it breaks up into cliques and groups that are competing power bases, ostensibly to protect themselves from the other groups, but actually they're also preying on the other groups to take their stuff. And it develops and grows and evolves that way, and eventually you end up with, of course, these groups are going to be very hierarchical, because that's the way it works in fear. You know, you're going to have to depend on somebody, but you don't want to depend on too many. You're going to have lots of people looking for other people, and everybody's riding on everybody else, and you're going to have a lot of hierarchy here. A lot of control mechanisms is why you need a hierarchy, to control people that you really don't trust. So you end up, at the end of this, with 3% of the beings over here in the fear group owning 98% of all the resources, and everybody else is in the hierarchy with all the peons on the bottom. Nobody trusts everybody. Everybody's out for themselves, trying to get along the best they can. Sounds like where we live, doesn't it? That's how our life is. Okay, over here in this group A, the love group, they have completely optimized the resources and the people in an effort to make everybody have as much free will, as much choice, as much ability, as much potential. Get everybody's potential developed out to the capacity of that potential. That's how you optimize. So you see the difference between these two groups. One of them's like where we live, the other one's like where we'd like to live. Okay, so what does that tell us about social groups? If you have social groups interacting, what's the side that's evolving, lowering entropy? And what's the side that's raising entropy? The love side lowers entropy, moves toward love. The fear side increases entropy. It's self-defeating, it's self-destructive, it's not sustainable. So not only do we have scientists saying that there's something bigger than us that's non-physical, and consciousness is the computer, but that love is the purpose. We're here to evolve to become love. So why would this information system create this virtual reality for individuated units of consciousness to play in? Because this is a entropy reduction trainer simulation. We log on here to play this game because of the choices we make. See, we have choices here. Well, why did you need the virtual reality to begin with? Well, when we were just communicating with each other, think of it as a big chat room. You know, you got millions of conscious, and all they do is just communicate with each other because you don't have much of a rule set. The only rules you have there are the rules that define communication. That's it. What are the consequences? Almost none. What are the issues? You know, what are the dilemmas? Almost none. So there's not a lot of choice. And the choices don't drive you to, you know, toward fear or toward love. They're just kind of bland. Well, you can evolve in that environment, but very, very, very slowly. A virtual reality with a tight rule set, a rule set that defines all energy exchanges such that you do something that affects somebody else. And what they do affects you. We all affect each other. We're all connected in this by this rule set of how we all interact and affect each other. You see, that is a game with consequences. You come here and you make choices and it makes a difference. Makes a big difference. If you make good choices, you end up being a happy camper. Your life is full of joy. Things work really well for you. You make poor choices, you end up miserable, struggling, full of fear, and not such a happy camper. So there's incentive here as well as choice. So now we get to what is this virtual reality? What does it mean when the scientists say this is a virtual reality and they agree that that is the right answer? It not only means that there's something that's the higher power, if you would, the more fundamental thing that's non-physical, that we aren't really bodies, we're a piece of consciousness, makes us immortal, that's interesting. We don't die as the physical body dies, but besides that, we have a purpose and a mission here, and that's to become love, to make choices to help the system evolve rather than make choices to help the system de-evolve. And as much as we are pieces of that system, the system wants to help us as much as it can because it wants us to succeed. That's why it made this neat virtual reality entropy reduction trainer for us to play in so we could make choices that matter and grow from those choices because we get consequences. So that is a rather big statement for the high priest of science to say to the world. There's something more powerful, non-physical, and the whole reason we're here is to become love. Think if that idea became a common idea across the population. That would make a big difference. So you see, it's not just about physics. It is about physics, but that's not the only thing. And just one last comment, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to fix some electronics. And that is that theories don't get much traction among other scientists unless they have experimental evidence. So last October of 2016, I presented a whole set of there's like 17 experiments, all quantum mechanics experiments. And they're in 5 groups. If you want to read about them and have them described to you, you can go to Google, and not Google, you can go to YouTube, and on YouTube, look up, do a search for, get on my site, my channel, YouTube, and search for MBT, as in my big toe, -LA, because I did these in Los Angeles, is where I gave the talk. And you'll find a whole talk that explains all these experiments. So now these experiments are out there, and these experiments, if they turn out the way I have predicted, will demonstrate, give very strong evidence for this being a virtual reality, consciousness being the computer. So there we have it. And we're in the process of getting these experiments done now. Matter of fact, in another 2 weeks, we're going to start a Kickstart program to help fund them to get them started, because we thought, well, we just take them to universities and they'd be glad to get them. But it doesn't work like that. They're busy. You know, you can't say, hey, stop everything you're doing and work for free. Nobody likes that in their job. So we're trying to get some funding to make this work. So this is not just theory, but it's also experimental physics. And we've got the experiments that will probably be done within a year or so. I think we'll get close. If this thing works, then we'll have them done we'll start on them maybe within 6 months or so. So that is kind of who I am and why I'm here, because the more people that understand that love is the answer, the more likely we'll do this right when the high priests of Western culture stand up and say this is a virtual reality. Otherwise, we might end up in a food fight. You know, this is a virtual reality. Oh, my God's a better programmer than your God. You know, we don't want to get into that. We don't want to go back to, you know, religious wars of whose God's a better programmer. So this virtual reality was not programmed. Virtual reality just evolved, not programmed. And we can talk all about that later, but now we're going to take a break. All right, let's start with the first question.
All right. Thanks a lot for coming to Atlanta, Tom. Huge fan. So I've got several questions here. Hopefully we have time to get around to all of them. I'm going to just ask the first question and we'll rotate. It's a two-part question. So I wrote it down because I was afraid I wouldn't be able to remember it. So I say many Eastern traditions have long, well-defined paths that an aspirant could follow to sort of accelerate the awakening process or experiential realization of consciousness as the fundamental reality. I'm just wondering if MBT has a prescription for this.
No, MBT doesn't have any kind of prescriptions really for anything. We can have some suggestions, and that's because growth is personal. You know, a group can maybe encourage you to grow because you're in a group of people who are growing, and that maybe it gives you some encouragement, but all progress, all growth is personal. It all has to happen inside of you. So you could spend your entire life in a monastery and not grow up at all. It's not the environment that grows you up, it's your own intent and your own doing the work. So you can grow yourself up, and I mean by grow up, lower your entropy, raise the quality of your consciousness, spiritual growth, however you want to put that. You can, you know, you not only have to do it by yourself, but there's really nobody that can help you very much. All that anybody else can do to help you grow up is to give you an environment that makes it a little easier for you to grow up, which means encouragement, you know, give you the space that you need or maybe the time that you need for doing things. That's about all you can do. Or you can have conversations with people that say, oh yeah, that was good, you're doing real well. That helps. But you can probably get that from other people you know who are on the path, and if you don't know any, if you're all out there by yourself, then you get that online. You know, there's a forum, there's an MBT forum where there's other people trying to grow and they interchange and talk. So you can get connected that way. And when we have these meetings, it's good to network. You know, find out who are these people who've come here, because they're all similar to you. They're all interested in growing, or they wouldn't be here. So no, I don't have anything. Now I have some processes. The main thing you have to do to grow up is get rid of fear. That's the key idea, is to get rid of fear. The way you get rid of fear is to first know that you have it. Most of us have fears and we have no idea that we even have them. They're things that are very subtle. Most of us have a lot of beliefs and we have no idea that we even have those beliefs. They're very subtle. But the fear not only creates belief, but it also creates ego. And ego is not subtle at all. Ego is really easy to spot. You spot ego by looking at your feelings. Anytime you feel angry, upset, annoyed, irritated, this whole list of things, even anxious, anxiety and stress, all these negatives. Anytime you feel a negative emotion, that's your ego. If you didn't have that ego, you wouldn't feel that negative emotion. So if you have a negative emotion, right there, you can find that, trace that back to your fear. Why do I have a negative? Why does that make me angry? And you can't blame it on somebody else. Oh, it makes me angry because so-and-so just said. No, it's not that they make you angry. You choose to be angry. Anger is your choice. You don't have to be angry. You could have other choices. So no excuses. Find the real reason why you're angry. Oh, I'm angry because I have a fear that I am inadequate, and that person just said something that triggered that feeling of inadequacy, and that's why I'm angry. All right, now you have the real cause, which is the fear of being inadequate. Now you work on that fear. You own it. You say, all right, that's me. I've got this fear of inadequacy and I need to deal with it. First thing to do is think about how has that informed all my choices. Go back through your last month, the last year, the last decade of your life and see how that inadequacy fear has made your choices for you. And when it does that, it'll give you a lot of incentive to get rid of it because you'll see that it's been the problem. It's been the thing that causes all the distress and all the anxiety and the negative and the things that don't work out in your life. So then you just have to have your intent from a deep level, I call the being level instead of the intellectual level, have a deep level intent to get rid of it. And that's really all you need to do. Future probability follows your intent. That intent to get rid of it will get rid of it. You'll catch yourself doing it. You'll catch yourself getting angry and you'll say, oh, don't want to go there. Now we're not covering it up with better behavior. That doesn't help. That doesn't make you grow. It's not about acting better, it's about being better. So then, and you feel that fear is making you, is producing anger, you just refuse to go there. Refuse to feel the anger. And first that'll be kind of intellectual. You'll stop yourself and you'll say no, you'll just kind of push your way through it. But you have to get rid of it, not bury it. And eventually, just with the intention to get rid of it, not to do that, not to feel that way, not to react that way, it'll get less and less and less and less until it goes away. And then you'll feel lighter. You'll feel terrific and you'll see everything in your life, all your relationships, everything will get better. So that's kind of the process. If there's any process at all, it's how do you deal with fear? But you have to do this individually. You see, it's an individual thing. Nobody can do that for you. So that's the process of finding the fear, getting rid of the fear. It may take a year or 2 years or 10 years to get rid of the fear, but whatever it takes, it's worth it. You just have to have that intent focused there long enough. If your desire to get rid of it is intellectual, I think I should get rid of that fear. Yeah, I see this fear and it bothers me and I really should get rid of it. That won't help. That's an intellectual intent. You'll just do a few things for a little while and then you go right back to the way it's always been. You really have to want to get rid of it at the being level, at the core of you. That's the key. And if you're there, then you will win and it will go away. And the hardest one to get rid of is the first one. The second one only takes half as long, and the third one maybe only takes a month, and the next one only takes a week. It gets to where you can offload these fears pretty quickly. So that's the process.
Okay, thanks. So this is sort of a second part. I think you partially addressed it. So in a recent talk, I heard that you say we grow up by making choices, as well as that it's the important part is the intent behind the choice that we make that actually helps us grow up, not the choice itself. So how do we work on improving the quality of the intent that goes into the choices that we make? What does one do? And then I have in parentheses that I realize it's not a doing, but it's a being, to get to the point where more choices naturally arise from the being level than the intellectual level.
Okay. This intellectual level and being level is a difficult thing to understand. People who are right-brained and intuitive, they'll understand it pretty easily. It's the difference between your intuition and your intellect. People who are left-brained and live out of their heads, kind of live through their intellect, they'll find a hard time differentiating between their intellect and their being level. And they'll probably say that they don't know that they even have any intuition, or if they do have it, it's not reliable. So it's a little harder for some people than others. But the way you accomplish these things, again, has to be from the being level. And you're really asking, how do I live more down at the being level? How do I get, well, it's a chicken and an egg sort of problem. You live more at the being level as you get rid of your fears. You need to get down to your being level to get rid of the fears. You just have to work it all together. The more you work on it, the easier it gets. So the being level is really where your feelings are. So pay more attention to your feelings. There's little feelings that come and go. Pay attention to those, because that comes out of the being level. Like we talked about anger. Nobody approaches anger intellectually. Nobody says, oh, they said that. I think I should be angry now. And then they go to anger. Anger just roars up out of you, right? You're just angry. You don't think about it. Anger is not an intellectual thing. It's a being level thing. You've got that at your being level. So that's sort of the difference between the intellectual level and the being level. The being level is also a way to do it. The being level is what you work out of in your dreams. When you dream, all of your interactions in your dreams tend to be from the being level. That's one of the great things about the dream reality, is your intellect isn't involved. If your intellect is involved, it's called a lucid dream. It's a different kind of dream. But if it's a regular dream, then that's all being level stuff. So the way you interact in your dreams is the way you really are. That may be good news or bad news, but So that's another thing. Pay attention to those dreams, because you can learn a lot there. But it's just practice, and it is intent. And if you really have this intent, you'll change things. It's the same with anything. If you, let's say, well, I'm going to lose weight, or I'm going to quit smoking. If you just say that because intellectually you think you should, it'll almost never happen. If you say that because you really want to, it's a being level thing, you'll quit. Not only will you quit, but you'll have almost no, what is it called? Withdrawal. Yeah, the withdrawal will almost be nothing, because you really want to quit. If you're doing it because you think you should, or because your friends want you to, or because somebody else wants you to, you'll have the worst withdrawals ever. And it'll be very difficult, and probably after 6 months or a year, you will have failed. And that's the same with anything you do. Losing weight, quitting smoking, whatever. Starting a new business, whatever it is you're into. If it's not from the being level, it's pretty shallow and doesn't necessarily last very long. So that's one of the things when you learn to do things like remote view or so on. The biggest trick there in being a good remote viewer is to get your intellect to sit down and be quiet and to work from the being level. If you work from the being level, it becomes easy. So easy that you can't even imagine that it could possibly work, because it's too easy. The hard part is finding out who you are at the core, being authentic. So your being level is where you are authentic. It's being the authentic self. It's not following your image, not who you think you should be, not who you want to see in the mirror when you look. It's who you really are at the core. Interesting thing about that is that once you get rid of your fear, you just are at the being level. All of you's at the being level. Your thinking, your analysis is all done at the being level. So see, it's not really the intellect so much as it is that intellect of yours is where the fear and the ego and the beliefs are all tied together. And because most of us are so full of that fear and belief and ego, our intellect is kind of polluted with that stuff. So that's why we say get rid of the intellect. I'm not really against intellect. Intellect is a very valuable thing. I'm against the fear and the ego and the belief that are bound up tight with that intellect. At the being level, you just are. So you get rid of all the fear, then you become a being of love. And you do that just by getting rid of the fear. You don't have to learn anything new. The love is there. All you have to do is get the fear out of the way. And then you have to keep working on it, otherwise you'll backslide. So that's the thing. Again, it's intent, being level, practice, just keep working, authenticity, be who you are. Most of us don't really know who we are. You know, if I looked at most people in there and said, who are you authentically, really, right down at the being level, who are you? And people would go, I'm not so sure. And then they think about it a little more and they're saying, I'm not so sure I want to know. You know? Because then I might have to deal with stuff that I really don't want to deal with. So that's a hard thing to do, but you can succeed if your intent is based on it. And yes, your intent is key because, morality, right and wrong, lowering entropy or increasing entropy is based on intent, not the action. It's the intent behind the action that is where the rubber meets the road in changing. So it's not so much what you do, it's more why you do it. What's your purpose behind it? That's what's really important. Because you can do the wrong thing. You can say, well, here's what I think's best, and you go do it, and it turns out that was a bad decision. That's okay, as long as you learn from it. Okay? So doing it wrong is not a problem. Doing it wrong and not learning anything is a problem. And doing it wrong and doing it wrong and doing it wrong and still not learning anything is even a bigger problem, which is where most of us live. So, you shouldn't be worried about whether you're doing it right or not. Just do it. See what happens. Learn from it. And modify it if you need to and do it some more. The worst thing you can do is get wadded up into, am I doing it right? Is this the right thing? Well, I can't really start because I don't know how. I don't know the best way to start. Just do it. See what happens. If it's not working for you, change it. It's an experimental thing. There is no set prescription for how to do these things. Everybody's an individual. Okay. That was a long answer, wasn't it?
Good morning.
Yeah.
Hi Tom, my name is Dr. Derek Murphy, and on behalf of the other chiropractors and chiropractic students in this room, I want to thank you and acknowledge you for your wisdom and experience that you're sharing here today. I have a unique question. When I glance at the sun in a clear view, I channel these symbols and I see them right here in my third eye field. And given what you just talked about, the virtual reality and consciousness, I'm curious about your opinion on the origination, the transfer, and the receive, how I receive these types of symbols.
Okay, tell me a little more about how you stare at the sun.
I don't stare, I glance.
Glance.
Very momentarily.
Good.
Very quick, just a quick open of the eyes and a close.
Mm-hmm.
And usually in the early morning hours, right as the sun is rising,
Right.
within the first 30 minutes or so. And so I receive the symbol, it stays in my third eye field, usually very detail oriented. I draw, I'm able to, enough time to draw it in notebooks, and then I blow them up and enlarge them into large paintings for various reasons. And so I'm curious, one, where are they coming from? And why do I receive them?
Okay. Start out with reminding you this is a virtual reality. And as a virtual reality, your reality is created by a data stream. Just like if you're playing World of Warcraft and you're playing the elf, that reality is created by a data stream being sent to your computer. Okay. Well, this reality is created by a data stream being sent to your consciousness. When your glance at the sun is a tool. It's a tool that you use to open your mind to receive something. Okay? You have an intention why you're there. You are not just casually happened to be walking around one day and, got a blink of sun and started getting messages. It's possible, but that's probably not likely. Most people who have your experience, it's because they're doing this on purpose, because they want to make a connection. They want to make, they want to get some information, and they find that this is a way, or other people have told them, or they've read about this is a way to gather information and make a connection. So that becomes then a tool for doing that. And what you get is what's been put in that data stream for you to get. The data stream is created by the computer that runs the virtual reality. All of your reality is. So why do you get particular symbols at particular times? Two reasons make up what you get, and one is it's what the system sends you. Now, why would the system want to send you anything at all? Well, because you're there to grow, to learn, to make a connection. That's a positive thing from the system. You're here to grow. The system's here to be a help for you to grow if it can. So from the system's viewpoint, it sends you that. Now, the other half of the equation is it's your interpretation. Your interpretation of whatever it is you get, what it looks like, why it looks like that. You have to take that, any information you get, you have to interpret it. You interpret it based on past experience, what's in your experience base. That's how you interpret it. So there are three possibilities of you getting data. One of them is the larger conscious system puts it into the data stream that you get. The second one is that it comes from some other IUOC, some other individual units of consciousness sending you some sort of information. Or third, you're creating it yourself. Those are the three sources of creating information. We're consciousness. We create information. We often call that our imagination, but we dismiss it as just an imagination. Imagination is really a very powerful thing. We create data. So you get something in your data stream, you have to interpret it. You interpret it on past information. You get something out of from yourself, out of your imagination. You get to interpret it. It's just the same way, and you get something. There are three different processes. Somebody sends you something. It could be any of the three. It could be all of the three. But why you get what you get is because that's what you interpret it to be. Where it comes from, you will never know. You cannot know, because the data in the data stream doesn't come with tags of where its origin is. It just doesn't come. It's just data. So it can be a mixture of your imagination, the larger conscious system, or some other IUOC. Chances are in this experience that you're having, some other IUOC is not part of the equation.
It doesn't feel like that.
Yeah, that's not part of the equation. So it's going to be, it's coming from the computer, or it's coming from your imagination. Now, people, when they get that, always have this problem of, is it real? They want to vet the source. Like, if it comes from my imagination, well, that's just a daydream, That's nothing. We can toss that out. That's just garbage you make up. It's not true. If it comes from the larger conscious system, well, that's good, That's like getting a letter from God, right? You're getting something from the source. So then that's terrific. But that is the wrong way to look at it. You want to maybe decide the significance of it. Well, you decide the significance not by naming the source, but by deciding over experience with it whether it's valuable or not valuable. That's how you decide it. Is it real? Is it outside of me? Is really not the right question. It's the wrong question. Our ego wants to know the answer to that. But it doesn't really mean much, because let's say it's something that you are learning from, something that's useful, something that you've been able to do. Well, you end up painting it. You end up making them. You're involved in it. It takes discipline. It takes concentration. That may be good just by itself, even nothing else added to it. That may be worth it, by itself. You get something from it. In that case, keep doing it. It's a good thing to do. You're learning. You're growing from it. If you do the experience and you get to the point that you're not getting anything out of it, well, then you let it go. See, it doesn't matter where it comes from. If it comes from the larger conscious system, you're not getting anything out of it, let it go. It comes from your imagination and you're not getting anything out of it, let it go. Or if you're getting something out of it, again, it doesn't matter where it comes from. We are never allowed to know the source. You just can't get to that. You never get the source of the data, only get the data. That's the way it
So you can say there's information contained within these symbols?
There may be. See, it depends. You get it. Now you interpret it, and now you'll have to see what can you make of it? What can you learn from it? There may be several things. Like I say, maybe it's just practicing your focus, your concentration, your ability to process. And that may be an exercise just to do those things. In which case, what they mean isn't all that important. Or it may be the meaning of it. What does it mean? Is it some sort of, is that Sanskrit symbol for, something? What is it? There may be a message that's on multiple levels there for you. So then I'd say work with it. Try to understand it. Ask the question in your intent. Why am I getting this? What should I do with it? And see what kind of answers you get. Do that from a meditation state. But if that draws a blank, then you'll have to make up your own mind to answer those questions. And if you decide it's useful, keep working at it. Something may come out of it. So you don't know. You never know. You may be doing these things and then you may run into somebody next week who recognizes those things and tells you, some other meaning it has for them. Oh, these are Sanskrit. I studied Sanskrit 3 years and I recognize those symbols. Or they may always just be things you saw that don't really connect to anything else, except they've given you a lot of training on getting them, processing them, and then holding them in your mind and taking them out of your mind and putting them onto paper or putting them onto a computer or something else. That's a lot of mental skills that are valuable. So it's hard to say what it is. That's personal to you, what it is.
Thank you. And you said a really interesting word there. You said training. How does training a skill here in this virtual reality help you become, you could say, more adept or more developed at decreasing entropy and moving more towards love?
Okay. I guess I should start out with kind of a caveat that says that you're doing something paranormal is not required to grow up. Okay, just in a general way.
Yeah, this is outside the symbol.
Yeah.
Outside the symbol, so it can be about anything.
Yeah, about anything,
Any
right.
kind of skill.
So doing something paranormal, as we talk about skills, many people may be thinking about paranormal skills, being able to feel somebody else's feelings, being able to taste somebody else's sandwich, be able to heal with your mind, being able to remote view or other things, or talk to dead people, or any of the other things that fall into that category. None of that is necessary to grow up. You can become love without ever doing anything that's paranormal whatsoever. It's not required. On the other hand, doing those things tends to help you grow up. They're not necessary, but they can be helpful inasmuch as they start to make you aware that reality is larger. As you get involved in these things, you say, oh, reality's bigger than this. And as reality gets bigger, you get smaller. And as you get smaller, your ego gets a little smaller too. You start seeing yourself in contrast with something that's a whole lot bigger than you. And all of that helps you grow, helps you see things. And as you try to determine what's the value of it, you have to do that by getting inside, by getting into your intuition, by getting into your, into your being level, because that's where all the answers are, it's down there at the being level. So it's training for that. So as you work at these skills, then you just naturally start to grow up, see a bigger picture, and realize that it's about love, it's about caring, it's about kindness, it's about being helpful. And It's not that anything maybe teaches you, says, oh, you need to be more loving. It's not that, but just that dealing with these bigger picture things tends to give you that attitude. So I've seen a lot of people grow up as they develop skills. Now, how do you develop skills? How do you get in a training course to do that? Well, there's lots of training that has nothing to do with physical teachers. You know, there's a saying in Eastern philosophy is that when the student is ready, the teacher will come. And that's true. Things will begin to happen. You'll start getting intuitive things. You'll start seeing symbols when you glance at the sun. You know, things will start to happen. Often that's the system's way of starting to communicate with you, starting to open you up, pry your mind open a little bit more, because now you're getting personally involved with bigger things, not just physical things. That's like the first steps. So the system will work with you, and you can say, put you in training, if you will, just to train you to accessing stuff at the being level. Because if you're really in your mind, if you're in your intellect, oh, I really want to see this. What is it now? Let me look. You know, that doesn't work. You don't get symbols when you're just out of your intellect. The way those come is if you just get in a calm space and let it happen. It just happens on its own. If you try to make it happen, it's not right, doesn't feel right. It isn't genuine. You have to let it happen. So in a sense, that's a training class, and working at the being level, which is a very positive thing. So the system will just work with you individually. As you're ready, you will get challenges, you will get things to do, and work them until they just don't seem to work anymore. So you don't feel like you're really gaining anything from the process. Save it and go on to the next one. And there'll be a next one, because maybe you finished that one. Or maybe there's more you could get out of that one. Maybe you haven't yet seen it from the right perspective, you know, to understand what meaning, what other meaning's in there. That's something you have to get out of your intuitive level, because you can't use your intellectual level to answer those questions. It's impossible. There is no intellectual answer. So you're stuck with intuition. And as you ponder these things intuitively, you're growing that intuitive muscle. So I say, it could just be you're in a training course, and you'll learn what you learn, and then you go on to something else. But yeah, that's true, that when you're ready, the teacher will come. Things will happen. You will just feel that certain things are right. You just feel like you need to pursue that. Yeah, that's kind of weird, but I really want to work on that a little bit more, try that a little bit more. And you won't know it, but you're developing skills that are very useful to your growth all the time. So I'd say that's what it's about. That's why you're doing it. And you don't necessarily have to come up with an intellectual meaning of what is its significant here in the physical world. There may not be any. It may just be a training course to get you to more connected at your being level, to let you more easily get into that empty space where it happens naturally, getting you used to the idea that you can let things happen and don't have to make them happen. These are all things that are a little counter to what we do here in the physical reality, so it's good exercise to be able to do them.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Tom.
Yeah.
In order for a being to be a conscious being, it needs to be sentient, and needs to have a decision state. One of the questions is, do we have awareness or unconsciousness that are local to this reality?
I define consciousness as something that has a finite decision space. Okay, it's awareness with a finite decision space. That means it has at least one choice it can make, or maybe two choices. One choice wouldn't be a choice, would it? It has an A or a B. It has choices that it can make. Okay, if there are no choices, then it's algorithmic. In other words, it just does what it does because there's a logic. You know, there's logic that says this is what it does. Okay, the sunflower follows the sun. As the sun goes across the sky, the sunflower follows the sun. It's not because the sunflower likes the sun and therefore it chooses to follow it, and if it wanted to, the sun could look the other way. what happens is that the sun warms this side of the stem, the other side of the stem is cooler, and that creates a torque in the stem that moves the sunflower toward the sun. Okay, that's an algorithm. You can do that with the sun, you can do that with a heat lamp, you can do that with all kinds of things, and it'll work exactly the same way, because it's just that's the machine, right? It's an algorithm. It's like our computers are programmed that way. Okay, so that's algorithmic. And some sort of life forms are like that, and we don't know. Let's go down to the level of in my book I talk about the clam. Let's go down to the level of a clam. Well, if you hit a clam's foot while his foot's out pushing himself around, it'll jerk it inside his shell. Is that because he says, oh no, something's out there, I better pull my foot in? Or is that just hardwired in his DNA so that something stimulates it, he jerks it in, no thought involved? If he thinks about it, pulls it in because he senses danger and then wants to pull it in so it's not so vulnerable, then the clam's conscious. If it just comes in because that's a response to a stimulus, then it's algorithmic. Okay? So now we get to what's conscious and what's not. We're conscious. Dogs and cats are obviously conscious, and horses and pigs and lots of other animals, squirrels. I mean, you can watch them play and interact, and you can see it's more than just algorithmic. They're not just responding. They're figuring things out. They're making plans. They're having choices. I've watched a bumblebee stalk my father once, who had the misfortune to swat and miss. This bumblebee buzzed up above a door frame. My dad ducked inside, closed the screen door, because now he didn't know where the bee was, so he thought he'd better hide. And that bee just sat up there, just right up above that door and waited and waited. 3, 4, 5 minutes went by. My dad figures it's all right to come out. He steps out, wham, stung him right on the back of the neck. To me, that was premeditated, which means a choice was made. So I credit that bumblebee for being conscious. It made a choice. It decided. It wasn't an algorithm. If it was an algorithm, it wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. It would have maybe been on the attack, nothing was there, the target was gone, and it would be gone. It'd go off to something else. But anything that can wait like that, stalk, that's consciousness. So insects can be conscious. Now, trying to decide whether a fly or a clam or whatever is conscious or not, it's a tough problem. You can teach flatworms how to go through a maze, but is that because they're making choices, or is that because their DNA is such, their hardwiring is such that it's adaptable, and they learn to go through the maze not because they're making choices, but because they just try everything and that works, and their DNA actually remembers it. So they may have memory, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're making any choices. You see, so we don't know. It's really hard to determine down on that low level. But are rocks conscious? I can't imagine a choice a rock makes. It doesn't choose to roll downhill. It does that for external reasons. It's not its choice. So that's my definition of consciousness. It stops at the point where it no longer has free will to make choices. So now we look at trees and bushes and things. Well, there's two components to that. One, you have to be aware, and two, you have to be able to make choices. I suspect that a lot of plants are aware, that they know what's going on in their environment. They're somewhat attuned and attached to things in their environment. I suspect it's vague. It's not like we're aware of our environment. It's not that detailed, but they are aware of their environment, it seems. But that doesn't necessarily mean they make choices. It just means they're aware. Now, it would take a lot of clever research to try to figure out whether or not they actually also made choices. And some of that research is getting closer to that because they've looked at the underground networks of the roots and how these things communicate with each other and how they pass things along. And there's one little seedling out there that's having trouble, and they send nutrients over to it. And lots of very complex stuff going on down there with fungi and bacteria and other sorts of things. But is that algorithmic, or is that choice making? I don't think we know that for sure. It's hard to tell the difference. So some things I put into the category of aware but not conscious, just not aware and not conscious like the rock, and aware and conscious like us and dogs and cats and bumblebees. So those are kind of the groups. And going from one group to the other is a little hard to tell, particularly those last two. So that's kind of the thing about consciousness and what's conscious and what's not. So let's talk about the bumblebees. And do we have a player for each bumblebee? I mean, does every bumblebee have an IUOC, that's playing the bumblebee? Well, it's possible. We have to look at the processing. The system is it's been around a very long time. One can assume it's very efficient. It does only those things it needs to do. It uses only those bits that it gets value from, and it does all of its processes in ways that is good computer science. In other words, it's efficient processing. Okay. So millions and millions of insects, billions of trillions of millions of insects, each one having an individuated unit of consciousness that is not like a human individuated unit of consciousness. Consciousness chunks would come in all different levels and capacities. Some are more applicable to bumblebees, and some are more applicable to humans, and some are more applicable to dogs and cats and horses. They're all different in their capacities, but it's all consciousness. So would it be a one-on-one with the trillions of insects that there are? I'd say probably not a good parsimonious choice on the system's part. Parsimonious just means kind of stingy with its resources. Parsimonious in the sense that it's very efficient. Because the choices are very limited. When you have very limited choices, then you don't need an individual making those choices. You maybe have some IUOC that makes choices for a whole hive full of bees. Or maybe for, all the bees in Georgia, I don't know. I'm making this up. You don't know, but I'm saying it's probably not a one-on-one because that's probably not efficient. Doesn't mean it isn't. I'm just looking at probabilities here. It could be one for many, particularly in those species where they have, hive mind, where it looks like it's a single mind doing the thinking, that it might be that way. Now this bumblebee that I watched stalk my father, he was a loner and he knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't part of any hive mind. He was on target and had a mission. So we don't know, the answers to all the questions with insects, but it could be one on many, could be one-on-one. The point is, what kind of lessons are you going to learn? How are you going to learn to lower entropy as a bumblebee? Well, I'm sure bumblebees have choices, things they can do, choices they can make. Hanging around just so you can sting somebody may not be one of the better choices. Trying to teach somebody not to swat at bumblebees, maybe that is a good choice. I don't know, but bumblebees evolve like the rest of us, and they evolve or de-evolve based on the quality of their choices, the effectiveness, whether that choice lowers entropy or raises entropy. So all of us are in the same thing. Us and the bumblebees have basically the same thing. We're trying to lower our entropy through good choices. So I don't know. I've kind of talked on a lot of the subjects you brought up, but did I stumble over what you really wanted to know?
It seems not impossible to me for this virtual reality to, throughout the years and throughout the years.
You're not going to have consciousness emerge from the virtual reality, because the virtual reality is just virtual. It's a computed reality. Again, ones and zeros on a hard drive. Ones and zeros on a hard drive making a pretty picture that we get to see. So, all that's rendered of me to you is just what you see. What's underneath the clothes you don't see, what's inside the body you don't see, the organs you don't see, none of that stuff's being rendered. None of that's necessary. Oxygen doesn't have to be rendered in this room. We just keep breathing because it's probable that we could be able to. You see? A couple of things were in there, and one is that can this virtual reality kind of originate or create its own levels of consciousness within the virtual reality? Yeah, and rather than being logged on from the larger conscious system, could it actually create consciousness of its own? And my answer to that is no. I don't think that is the way it would work. We are simply, the virtual reality isn't really computing us. This is what I was saying before, but evidently I wasn't clear. The virtual reality isn't computing us in our entirety, our organs and all of that kind of stuff. It's just eye candy, just like the elf. When you're playing the elf on World of Warcraft, you don't get an elf with internal organs and a heart beating and breathing oxygen and all that. You just get a picture that looks like an elf. That's the data you get. The only data you get is what you see. It's the data that we look at each other. All the rest of that stuff's not computed. It's just a virtual reality. It's only to make you to see and interact with what's there. So there's no brain that's being rendered in my head. All that's rendered is just what you see. That's what I was saying before. Nothing else. That pretty eye candy on the surface that makes it look like there's a bunch of people sitting in here, you see, isn't going to evolve into something more complex. It's just a very superficial image of what we get. There's no reason that the computer would calculate all that internal stuff, my heart beating, my liver, Matter of fact, for all of you, it's not even computing, the back of my head because you can't see that. So it's not in your data stream. If somebody were back there, it would be in their data stream, but it wouldn't be in your data stream. You only get in your data stream what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you feel. That's all that comes into your data stream. And that is not going to evolve into something else. You see, it's not going to form a consciousness. So virtual reality is just enough information for the game to go on. Why would it want to do anything else? But now it has to abide by the rule set. And I mentioned this at the very end of my initial talk, and that is that this is not a programmed reality, virtual reality. It's an evolved virtual reality. You start with initial conditions, and what were those initial conditions? It was that ball of plasma, high temperatures, high pressures. That was it. And besides the initial conditions, you have a rule set. A rule set says how energy can exchange. So in other words, how this stuff can interact with each other, what it does. Okay? So that's the rule set. What's the rule set? Well, science, what we call science, digs out facts of the rule set. That's what science is. When science says, oh, we've discovered such and such, well, what they've really discovered is a piece of the rule set. The rule set defines how this reality works. In World of Warcraft, they have a rule set too. The rule set says that my elf can't run through a tree. If he hits a tree, it'll hurt him. He'll bounce off, fall on the ground, lose hit points. If he falls off a cliff, it might kill him. So on. There's rules to the game. That's what makes a game, are the rules. So you have this rule set. So the fact that you get hit on the head with a pipe, okay, and afterwards you slur your speech, drag your left leg. Brain damage, you say, well, what brain? Well, the rule set is here to set constraints on what can happen, just like in World of Warcraft. It sets the constraints on what's possible. It's our science. It defines what's possible and what's impossible. So if you get hit with an iron pipe on your head, then that changes the constraints that avatar has to play with according to the rule set. You see? So the rule set says that if you've been hit on the head, then you're going to have brain damage, a virtual brain damage, and that's going to cause certain things. And there's probability in there, so it takes some random draws at a probability, and that's what you've got. Now the consciousness doesn't have brain damage. The consciousness is just consciousness, but it has to play a character with more constraints. So The rule set, here, let's talk about the rule set a minute. So the rule set has been created just to create the virtual reality. Consciousness wants a virtual reality because it wants an entropy reduction trainer, and it needs to be rule-based. So we have choices and consequences. So it starts with initial conditions and some rules. Okay, so then see how that works. It probably runs for a little bit and bombs. That's the way most of the computer science stuff works, right? When you're doing trial and error, you're evolving it, it bombs. So then you change the rules a little bit. Oh, it goes a little longer. Good. Then it bombs. So then you change the rule set. It's a little better this time, but these other things got worse. So you keep fiddling with it. So it evolves until you've got a rule set that'll evolve something that'll last for what, 5.5 billion years, so that the evolution according to the rule set can take place to provide avatars that make interesting choices. So that takes really a very fine-tuned set of rules, or the thing will just come apart in 5.5 billion years of evolution. What evolves is just whatever would evolve there according to the rules. According to the system, of course, is looking at it. The system can tweak it, and this brings us up to something that I'll just throw in here. There's a thing called the anthropic principle in physics, and that says that there's a bunch of constants that are fundamental constants, and if you change any one of these constants, even in the 8th decimal place, the whole thing goes to hell in a handbasket and the universe collapses. Won't work. It's a fine-tuned balance of forces and things. And it's called the anthropic principle because it seems like with all these constants, tuned to 8, 10 decimal places, that must have happened on purpose, right? Somebody must have planned that. Well, it evolved. That's what worked. And those decimal places were tweaked and tweaked and tweaked till it got a good simulator that could last long enough to be useful. In the beginning, everything was played by the computer. All characters were played by the computer as they naturally evolved. Some of that was just chance. Some of it was randomness. Could have evolved lots of different ways, but random draws were taken. Computer plays all the characters until the evolution got up to a point that there was interesting choices being made. And when they got to that point, there were interesting choices being made that consciousness could grow from. Consciousness started logging on and playing those avatars. And they were no longer run by the computer, they were run by this IUOC that decided to log on and make those choices for that avatar. So that's kind of the way it goes. But what the virtual reality is, it's not us with all our organs and the oxygen and all that stuff. It's just what you see. And yes, it was made very particularly to make the thing work. It evolved. So that's what I mean by it's an evolved simulation. It's a simulation, but an evolved whatever we've got now. We've got a universe, we've got at least this planet and this solar system that's evolved people, and that just happened because that's what happened in the evolution of things. With the random numbers drawn and everything else, that's what you got. Then you got logons from the IUOCs. So then here we are. Eventually, almost all of the avatars have IUOCs playing them. Occasionally, you'll have NPCs, non-player characters, things that are played by the computer, coming in, interacting, going away, cameo roles. So we have NPCs every once in a while when the system wants to do something and it takes somebody here to do it. So we get some of those. And if you get an IUOC that is not interested in playing a bumblebee, well, you might have some that are, but maybe some, they may be that might be just right for them, bumblebee level. Or maybe you'd have a whole bunch of bumblebees in a swarm that are now more interesting because as a group, as 10,000 of them, there's more choices there that they make and more interaction. And probably also a lot of random draws going on with that. So maybe it's played that way. Or maybe the system still plays those as NPCs. Doesn't mean they're not conscious. They're still conscious, they're just being played by NPCs. And now you look at it and you say, well, there's not a lot of difference there. We are parts of the larger consciousness system. And an NPC is being played by the larger consciousness system. you see? So it's not like, oh, we're real and they're fake. There's not a whole lot of difference between us. We're both pieces of consciousness or playing things in the virtual reality. So whether it's an NPC or not, it's kind of almost irrelevant to us. Being here, it doesn't make any difference. So that's it. But the reason I say no is because it's just eye candy. All that's being computed is what's superficial. There's nothing else needs to be computed. The system only computes what it needs to do this evolution. But if you cut open a body, if you take one of those reptiles and you cut them open, you'll find all these organs and things in there and blood vessels and all sorts of stuff. Well, anything you cut open has to be explained. And it has to be explained from 2 viewpoints. One, it has to be consistent with history. You can't open up one lizard and it's got, little pink cogwheels and gears, inside, and you cut up another one and it's got something totally different in it. It has to be consistent, and it has to be in consonance with the rule set. It has to abide by the rule set. So until you cut something open, there is no data in the data stream. So in that case, that consciousness would evolve here on its own without coming from outside is about the same probability that consciousness would evolve in your Word document. They're both just data, ones and zeros on a hard drive. So it's not likely. It doesn't mean that everything here that's conscious is played by an IUOC. The computer may be playing some of it. And maybe insects at some level, or clams and things are all NPCs. All just still played with the computer because they couldn't find any IUOC that was interested in making those choices.
Are you an NPC?
No. I'm not an NPC. The question was about conscious computers, all right? How does that work? Computers will be conscious one day, but it's not because that consciousness will be programmed into the computer, or that a computer will be programmed in such a way that the instructions will somehow magically become conscious. It doesn't work that way. That's what among psychologists and people studying consciousness, they call that the hard problem. Nobody can figure out how it is that consciousness just manifests somehow, you see? Well, it doesn't manifest somehow. The way conscious computers will become conscious is that the hardware and the software will create an environment in which the simulated avatar, whatever it is, will have choices. And these choices will not be algorithmic, which means they'll be real choices, free will choices. So you have to do that. Now, we have ways of doing things real similar. They're called neural networks. They're not algorithmic. It's not that software says if this, then that, and if that, then this. It's not algorithmic. It's all kinds of data comes in and the computer takes it and does whatever it does with it and comes out with a choice of what it wants to send out for an answer. And the people who build it have no idea why it came out with that choice. They don't know, because it's too convoluted in there and it's all dependent on other things and its history and its learning and everything else. Well, you've got something that's making choices, then a individuated unit of consciousness can log on and make those choices for it, you see? So let's say we get a computer and that computer provides this environment of free choice, non-algorithmic. If those choices are interesting, an individuated unit of consciousness will log on and play those choices because it can learn from those choices. So here you have a human avatar and there you have a metal box with silicon chips and other things. It's just another avatar. Just like this, it's just a different avatar. But it's being played by a consciousness from the larger conscious system, just like this avatar is. But it's going to be a different set of choices. So it's going to be a little different kind of IUOC, if you will. It's going to have different limitations and different strengths and whatever. It'll adapt to those choices. And all it can do is make the choices that avatar has. So that avatar is now a computer. Okay, so now there you are and you've got this computer and it's conscious and some avatar, it is an avatar, some IUOC is playing it, and you pull its plug. Did you kill it? Of course not. It's consciousness. When you plug it back in, it loads and boots back up, and it still can make those choices, and the conscious still play it. You see? It's just a different kind of avatar being played by conscious. Now let's take it another step further. If this isn't convoluted enough, we'll make it more convoluted. Let's say we have this big computer, and this big computer, let's say it's a mainframe here. It's a physical computer built in this virtual reality, of course, all virtual parts and whatever. And this virtual computer, okay, now has things inside of it, things that it's done inside of it that have, say, neural networks, just as a metaphor, has non-algorithmic choices inside of my big, Hewlett-Packard mainframe. Okay, so maybe Hewlett-Packard doesn't make mainframes anymore, but you get my point. So it does that, and could those avatars inside the Hewlett-Packard become conscious? Sure, why not? If it's inside that Hewlett-Packard has avatars that make interesting choices, some IUOC from the larger conscious system can log on and make those choices too. And if in that system, it creates a computer that has things that, so you can nest virtual realities. You can virtual reality inside of virtual reality inside of virtual reality. But it's not likely that that happens at a very deep number of levels because it becomes very inefficient. It's a very inefficient process to have that third level down virtual reality being processed by another virtual reality being processed. That's tremendous calculation overhead and burden, when if you wanted that other virtual reality, you just make it from scratch. You wouldn't have to go through all this other stuff, all this other virtual reality processes to get there. So it's not practical to do, but theoretically, they can nest like that.
Like a Mandelbrot set. Like a Mandelbrot set.
Yeah, it can continue. Yeah, it can go and do that. It's just not, it's not a practical thing from a computer science standpoint. But so yes, computers will be conscious, and within those conscious computers, we could even have more things that are conscious. See, our computers are just virtual computers, just like have virtual bodies. It's a virtual piece of metal with virtual chips inside, with virtual wires and circuit boards and virtual solder. It's all just information. And that information has results, that structure. Remember, we're talking about organization of information. That organization of information allows you to store Word documents and do word processing and other stuff, because that's just the logic of that organization. Well, we got a logic of organization in our avatar, too. It has to do with cells and organs, and all of that's our logical organization. It allows us to do certain things. We get hit on the head with an iron pipe, we just messed up that organization to a point that there's new constraints. Consciousness has to play it with the new constraints. So you can nest virtual realities, you can have conscious computers, but all of the consciousness comes from the same source. It's the larger consciousness system is supplying all the consciousness. And that the ones and zeros on the hard drive don't have what it takes to become conscious. We're not really these beings with organs and things and brains and neurons. That's a virtual brain. And the virtual brain is never rendered unless somebody cuts a head open. Then there's a virtual brain. Think about the elf. Let's say that we have a new kind of elf who's brain searching. Okay, and this elf, has all these tools in a little black bag, and he goes in and he cuts, some other elf's head open in order to heal him. So he cuts that elf's brain open. What are you going to see? Just a black hole that goes nowhere? No, the people who produce that game are going to put something in there. They got to put something in there. That inside that skull now is taking up 100,000 pixels. They got to fill those pixels with something. They're not just going to let those pixels be empty. So that's the brain. You'll see elf brain in that elf. But once he sews his head back up, computer's not going to continue to render a brain inside an elf whose head's sewn up. It's not parsimonious. It's a waste of resources. So that's how the system works. I know it's very mind-bending. It's hard to get your mind around these concepts, but once you do, it simplifies everything else. Everything else in your life, all the science, the biology, everything else just simplifies, just amazingly. Okay, did I finally get to it? Good. Over here, who has it?
Hearing things on YouTube, I'm very used to it, and while I'm listening, I have my eyes closed during meditation, and then my body started jolting, and my head was shaking like that. I'm curious what that means.
Well, that's part of what's called the pulsation state, and actually it's a good state. It means that you've let go of the outside reality, and you are now no longer in your body. It means you're no longer getting data. You're no longer getting a data stream describing the physical reality. So that's good. That's where you want to go. And the only bad thing that can come out of it is that it frightens you. And if it doesn't frighten you, then there's really nothing bad that can come out of it. Just go with it, ride it. The more attention you give it, the stronger it'll get. If you put your attention away from it, it'll tend to settle down. So think of it as a signpost that you've been successful, that you've disconnected yourself from the physical reality completely. And now your sensory input is just gone a little nuts because there aren't any signals anymore. Typically your body has all these signals that are always bouncing each other. You know, do this, well, it's too much. Do it a little less, well, that's too little. Now do it a little more. And they're always hunting and trying to balance each other. Our whole body's made up of all of these circuits, all this biology that is balanced, just so. And when you take away all the physical inputs, it doesn't know what to do. It doesn't know what to balance. It doesn't have any point of reference anymore because you've taken all the input signals away. So it tends to wander and dither and kind of jump around. And as your EEG goes down into the theta state, those pulses are often around 4 hertz, like about this. They tend to be that sort of thing. And it's just a sign that you've let go of the physical world. And eventually it'll kind of go away, except it may be very subtle in the background. But in the beginning, it's really huge. And it can be scary to people because they can sometimes feel like loud noises, electric shocks. They're being vibrated back and forth. And it'll not hurt you. Think of it as a fun ride. You're going to ride it like you would a bucking bronco. You know, you're going to ride this thing till it calms down and you master it.
You at one point called the system entropy reduction trainer. I love that. But it does imply its purpose. It does imply the purpose of its own, right? The system as it has the purpose. It's after something, entropy reduction in this case. And so I'm going back to your notion of programmed and evolved, because you kind of yourself go between the two while at the same time stating it's evolved. Because you go back and you say there's initial set of rules, right? And the initial conditions from which it starts. So those rules that we are discovering had to be somehow programmed. You also mentioned several times the system is kind of intervening, sending these information. Well, as if it has agenda, right?
Yes,
it
does.
The second law, if it is entropy reduction trainer, then it doesn't make sense that we have second law of thermodynamics, right? That we have to fight against, as if it's a device for training, right? Because it won't increase the entropy unless we put the energy into it, right? So it doesn't make sense from that perspective. But this is a little bit convoluted. How much of it is programmed and how much of it is evolving? And then when you go back to these ideas of not rendering unless necessary, I love it. But it had to be programmed. What will be found in the lizard's brain if somebody opens it? So it stays consistent on the other side of the world.
Okay.
Do you see?
No, okay. Yeah, let me answer those. There's a lot of questions there. Okay, as far as what's programmed and what's not, this virtual reality evolved, just as virtual reality. But this is just one thing. There's lots of virtual realities in the system. This is just one of them. So all of them didn't necessarily evolve, but this one did. Because it had to evolve from a rule set, because the rule set defines how it works. So the reason when you cut a head open that you'll find a brain, or a body open and you'll find veins and things, it's because those were necessary during the evolution to produce something that would persist. That's how evolution works. If it didn't work, it would go extinct. It wouldn't work, it would disappear. So the only things that are left as avatars now, from the lizards to the people to whatever, are things that were able to survive in the virtual environment according to the rule set. So that's why our bodies are really just manifestations of the rule set. The way these rules could be, the way things could have gone together in such a way to produce this, because when they went together to produce something that wasn't survivable, that went away. So we're left at the end with just what worked. So if you take the rule set and you just bounce it around through those stimuluses and those requirements of procreation and survival, you end up with us. And the lizards and the jellyfish and all the rest of it found little niches in which they could survive in. So that's why they're there. So all of that is virtual, starting from initial conditions and a rule set. Okay? Because of that, we have evolved to survive because of our inner structure, because we have veins, because we have differentiated organs, which makes us more adaptable. We can do things that otherwise we couldn't do. That's why we survived and things that weren't that adaptable didn't. Okay? So when you cut somebody open, you're going to find those veins and organs and things, because the evolution in this simulation, that's the way it went. See, so it's just part of the way that it evolved. But you're not going to render any of it until somebody cuts it open. Then you have to render it, and you render it according to the rule set, which is how it happened to evolve from the initial conditions. So that's why you have that. But now you also have the larger conscious system that had to create this virtual reality. So sure enough, it created it. Now it had to figure out, how am I going to do this? Okay, well, you start with something and see how that works, see how that evolves. And the way you make a game, the way you make a virtual reality is with rules. No rules, no game, right? So you make these rules and you see how it works. Well, it didn't work. And just like any other evolution, if it doesn't work, you throw it out. Try something else, see if it works. Eventually, you evolve something that works and lasts long enough to do this. So the system had to first come up with a virtual reality would be handy here. Someplace where we will have choices that are more dramatic, that make a difference, that have consequences, that people can make decisions that really give them feedback of whether that was a love decision or whether that was a fear decision. Fear decision, you get slapped in the face by a wet fish. A love decision, you get to smile and feel happy. So they make this trainer that you're successful on how much that you become love. So that was thought of, executed, evolved till it worked, and you needed a very specific, very tight rule set to produce something that's physical, like this. But the only thing that's fundamental is consciousness. Everything else is virtual. So you die here, right? Your consciousness wake up in another virtual reality. You dream, you're operating in another virtual reality. You can learn to travel around in this system and you'll find dozens and dozens and dozens of virtual realities. And there's another, I don't know, from my experience, I'd say there's, let's say, 2 or 3 dozen realities that are like this one, which means they have a rule set that's tight enough that it's like physical, because that means every detail of every interaction is according to a rule set. There's rules for everything. In the dream reality, it's a loose rule set. You can do all kinds of things there. You can fly around, you can teleport. There's lots of things you can do there. The rule set's not all that tight. In the reality that you get to transition reality after you die, that's even less tight. You see, it just has a very specific function. It didn't have to be evolved. It just is a reality. It's got certain functions that it needs to perform. It just performs those functions. So the system can just set that up. But something that's complicated as what's a physical reality just means the rule set is so complex and so detailed that every detail of every interaction is tracked and has to work. So that's how it is. So you do have a system The larger system is like the operating system, okay? It's the thing that figures, it tells everybody else what to work and keeps everybody else straight. So that's the operating system. A piece of that system is set aside as our computer. Another piece of that system is set aside as a computer for some other virtual reality. You see, we get our own clock. Our clock is a delta T that you know, runs our dynamics. Some other system has its own clock with its own delta T, runs its dynamics. So they're all, does that kind of answer your question? It's all, yeah, okay.
So Tom, so does the consciousness have memory?
Yes, of course.
Like when we now have 5 cents. Won't have your question.
Okay.
Was that
Yeah, the question was, does the conscious system have memory? And it's yes. Consciousness has to have memory. If it didn't have memory, every instant would be its first. You know, it wouldn't have any background. It wouldn't have any, couldn't build on anything. You can't learn without memory. You're not really, won't have anything to make choices without memory. You have to have memory to create experience, and experience is what you make your choices out of. So memory is important, but our virtual brain processes nothing, remembers nothing, really has no other function than to represent the rule set within our evolution that limits what it is we can do. That's what the virtual brain is for. All the memory, all the feelings, all other stuff, it's all in consciousness. Just like with the elf, works the same way. So yes, memory is required for consciousness.
My question is about the big cheese. How did you feel the first time you met the big cheese? What happened to the last big cheese before this one? And is the big cheese mortal? Do they also die and start over and get their memory wiped and all that?
All right, who's the big cheese? I'll tell you, many people are going, big cheese? What's this? Right? In my book, I try to keep humor and I try to keep it light because I don't want to start another religion. I don't want people to get too wound up with it. I don't want them to take it too seriously. These are ideas, these are metaphors, things to think about. It's a model by which you can construct your understanding of reality. In a consciousness system, not only do you have to have memory, you have to have some management. Management is part of the operating system, right? That's what manages the rest of the program, tells the program what it can do and so on. So the reason you need management is because you have rules. If you don't have rules, I mean, if you have rules, you also have to have some enforcement. Otherwise, the rules are irrelevant. If you're populating these systems with conscious choice-making things that have to obey rules, then you need some enforcement. You need somebody in charge, some management. And the big cheese is a kind of a fun, not too serious name that I gave the manager over what I called N division in the book. Okay, I give a kind of a corporate metaphor. And N division has in it multiple reality systems. This is just one of those virtual realities. There may be, you know, a dozen of these virtual realities. In the book, I name them, you know, N plus 1, N plus 2, you know, these are all the things in N division. And this entity's job is to kind of oversee what happens in N division, the various virtual realities, going there to see that they basically abide by the rules, they're working out, things are going the way they should, because if there's something really broken, the system would like to know about it sooner rather than let the whole thing, you know, ball up. You know how it is with computers, right? If you get this big system and things break, the faster you know about it, the easier it is to fix, the easier it is to deal with before it gets bigger. So this is the big cheese, and that's his job. He's a manager over N division, of which we are a part. His management chain is very flat. There's not a lot of hierarchy involved. It's very, very flat. About, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago, I could maybe pin that down some if I thought about it a lot, but there was a change in the big cheese job. The entity that was there, who had been there in a very long time, it was time for that one to move on. It wasn't doing its job very well. Some of the systems were getting out of balance, and another big cheese was put in its place. It wasn't an election, it was an appointment, and I just happened to be around and be in tune with things that are going on in the larger conscious system, to be aware of that process that was going on. So that happened our time, I'd say, about 25, 30 years ago. And since then, there's been a fair amount of change. The management has been more attentive, more aware of what's going on. Things have balanced. Some of the balance has returned that was lacking before. So does that answer your question? Some of it. So it's just a management function. Now, I suspect there may be another level of management before you just get to the larger conscious system at the top. Maybe not. Big cheese may be the first level down from that. I don't know. But as far as the big cheese goes, that's as far as my vision goes. You know, it is when you look up there in the organization, you're looking uphill through the organization. You can only see so far before everything else becomes mystical after that. And the big cheese is as far as I see. I suspect, I had a strong feeling that there was another layer of management there, but it might have just been the system itself. May have been that layer because it's a very flat management system.
My question is, a lot of recent journals have posted publication about observational reactivity, where protons and photons are reacting differently under observation as when they are unobserved. Does that, in your theory, allow for the altering there of this particular reality through observation? And also, if you could please give a further explanation on the connectivity function for, say, someone who may be in a loss of consciousness, where a person may lose consciousness and return to consciousness. Where then does that consciousness go in relation to this?
Okay. The reason you have an observer effect is the reality, this virtual reality, only exists in the minds of the players. Okay, only exists in the minds of the players. Now, I know that's when you apply it to yourself, it's like that's just too far out. But think of the World of Warcraft. Okay, where is that World of Warcraft? Where are those monsters? Where are those rivers and rocks and streams and buildings and all of that stuff that makes up the World of Warcraft map? Where is that? Servers. It's only, the servers send out data. That reality is only in the minds of the players. What the server sends out is data streams. What the server sends to you isn't a river and a stream and a rock. It sends to you 2 million pixels. Each pixel has 3 components. It's got a position, it's got an intensity, it's got a color. That's it. So you get 2 million intensities, positions, and colors, dots. That's what the system sends to you. You look at those 2 million dots, and you turn that into rivers and streams and rocks and buildings with doors and doorknobs that have to be turned. You interpret that data to be that reality. It's the same way it is here. Consciousness gets a data stream. The individual conscious interprets that data stream to be this reality. So the World of Warcraft, with its rivers and streams and doors and doorknobs, only exists in the minds of the players. The computer doesn't compute a doorknob. The computer computes dots of light with a position, an intensity, and a color. That's all it computes. And it computes how to arrange them on the screen. You interpret it as rivers from your interpretation. So because the reality only exists in the minds of the players, if the data is never put into the mind of a player, it can't be in the virtual reality. See, there's nothing that can be in the World of Warcraft that doesn't come to you, go on your screen as dots. If the dots aren't there, then whatever they would represent isn't there either. You see?
But I'm asking about the explanation between the way they react when they're observed and the way they react when they're not.
So the difference is, you see, when you send, let's say in a double slit experiment, an observer is an important part of that experiment. Okay? the important thing here isn't the observer or the observer's consciousness so much. I mean, both of those are important, but it's the information. It's about information. So if the information comes to an observer or is available for an observer to look at, that the particle went through slit A or slit B in a double slit experiment, then that, because it came to an observer, that now is a fact that is part of the physical, the virtual reality that seems physical to us, right? It becomes a fact here. If there is no observer, if there's no, that the data never came to anybody, in other words, there was never any pixel lit up on a screen, it's not part of the reality. So that's why it changes it. When there is an observer, that means that information has come into this reality that an observer or any observer can look at. So the double slit experiment, you have which way data. Which way did the particle, which slit did the particle go through? It's got two choices. Which way did it go? Well, once you have that information here in this reality, then the result is going to be no diffraction pattern. It's going to be just light or particles that pile up behind the slits, because there's no information here to determine otherwise, because nobody got that data doesn't exist. But once that data is here, it's a fact. And the only way it gets to be a fact here is if it comes to a consciousness logged into this game, and now it's part of a fact of the virtual reality. So that's why you have the observer effect. In a virtual reality, that observer is a key part of what shows up in the reality, because all the reality exists only in the minds of the players. You see, there is no objective reality. It's only in the minds of the player. The player is the consciousness. The player is the observer. If the observer doesn't get any data, then that can't possibly exist in the virtual reality. So that's why the observer is important in quantum mechanics. And it's not really that a consciousness has to look at it. It's that there's information. Either it's in the reality or it's not. And the only way I can get into the reality is through an individuated unit of consciousness getting that information. So that's the observer. You see, that's how that works. So that's one of my experiments. I told you I had a bunch of experiments. That's one of the experiments I have, is that you set up a double slit experiment and you have detectors detecting which way data at each slit, and then you just turn off the detectors. I mean, you turn off the recorder. They're recording the detections. Let the detectors detect. Just turn off the recorder that's recording the detections. So now you've eliminated the information. When you eliminate the information, no IUOC, no consciousness gets any information, because there is no information to get. It's not being created. Therefore, it makes a difference. So that's one of my experiments, is you just turn off the recorder and watch the particles redistribute themselves. Has nothing to do with the detectors at all. Which right now, scientists would say, oh no, it's the detector. It's that connection with the detector that makes that difference. There's an entanglement with the detector. And virtual reality says, you don't need that. That's complexity that is unnecessary. It's a simpler system to do it the other way. Not that it couldn't be done that way. It's just that it would not be parsimonious, I believe, to do it that way. So it would be simpler to not. So that's the observer effect. It's because it's a virtual reality that you need the observer, because the observer creates the reality. Okay, one over here.
In the other virtual reality, or so, under the Big Cheese Indivision, have you visited them with the same level of reality that you do when you're here?
Yes, I can visit them in two ways. I can visit them, and I say anybody that's going around in this reality can do this. You visit them either as an observer, in which case you can see what's going on, you can hear the conversations, you can understand, but you're an observer, you're non-physical to that reality frame. That's one way. That's the easiest way. There's no particular constraints on that, anybody that's available. The other way is to actually get a body inside that reality to where now you are there in the reality. So now you can press flesh and shake hands and meet people and throw rocks. You can do whatever anybody can do in that reality. You're bound by that rule set. With actually
possessed on that side,
huh?
right? No. They're almost like demon possessed on that side.
No, when you're in the reality, you don't take over somebody's thing. You create your own body. So you get what you're doing. You're not creating the body. See, these are all metaphors. What you're doing is getting your data insinuated into that reality frame. So now the computer starts sending out to all the players there interactions with you. So you just become a character in that virtual reality. You're not taking over somebody's body. You're just manifesting one of your own. Now that one is a little harder to get into. You have to get cooperation with the system to do that. The system needs to put your data in the computer and allow you to do it. So you need to have already earned some credentials as a player that won't screw things up if they allow you that privilege to go in there. You can't just drop in the middle of a crowd and say, here I am, and just suddenly you materialize. That wouldn't work, and you can't go out the same way. You have to be subtle. You have to not create disturbances in the reality that you visit. There's other rules. So as long as you play by the rules and kind of get your, hall pass that you could, go out there on your own, then the system can support that. But that's not as easy to do, and it takes more time to develop a good working relationship with the system before you can do that. But it's quite possible, and does that mean if I can do that there can do that here? Sure, they can do that, but the same rules apply. You have to be inconspicuous and not make a fuss and not do anything that interrupts or changes or modifies what's going on there. It's more of an observer role, if you want, but observing from inside rather than outside.
That explains why some things can be done here that are not part of the regular rule set, because
all kinds of things can be here that are not part of the regular rule set. Remember, it's a virtual reality. The system wants to put some data in that reality and send it to you. Well, you can find little green men with pointy ears standing at the bottom of your bed that morning when you wake up, because that data's just been put into your data stream. You and your friends, 4 or 5 other people, you've been playing bridge with them that night, and you got 4 or 5 people all go outside. They hear sirens, they see helicopters going over, they see fire, flames shooting up in the air up 2 or 3 miles away where a big factory is. Sirens are going off. It seems like, all sorts of, something terrible has happened, and they can, say, drive away someplace to get away from all of that. They can come back 2 or 3 hours later, and everything's just normal. And they can go to their neighbors, and they went to their neighbors when they saw all that stuff and say, oh, what was that? What did that turn out to be? What was going on there? And the neighbor goes, what? What stuff? Well, I was just standing next to you about 3 hours ago, and we were looking at it and talking about it. What have you been drinking? See? So the system can put anything it wants in your data stream if it thinks that's valuable to you to grow up. If it's part of your process of growing up, a lot of times when it does that, it's just a wake-up call. Look, reality's bigger than you thought. Isn't this weird? It's not just this buttoned-down place you thought you lived in. It's in this really weird space that's multidimensional, and it just opens people's minds a bit to something bigger than just this material thing in our rule set. So the rule set can be broken. It's just data in a data stream. So if the system would like to wake you up, it can send you any manner of things to let you know that it's not just this buttoned down, material place that you thought it was. And it'll work with you with that.
You mentioned entanglement. How do particles become entangled?
It's an if-then statement.
So what?
An if-then statement in the computer code. If this one's spin up, then that one's spin down. If then. So you switch this one, and the code right away flips that one.
How do they become entangled in the first place?
They're entangled in the first place because of some kind of conservation law that's part of the rule set. The rule set creates these things. So you got a particle, it's got a certain momentum, and it's got a certain amount of charge and other things. That's properties, right? and it splits into two. And when it splits into two, these two particles don't just kind of hang there stuck to each other, they go off. Well, conservation,
How do they split?
It's just a random thing that happens. It's there, and then
Well, if they're doing teleportation experiments.
sometimes it just flies apart because of that's just random stuff. Okay, it happens because it can randomly happen. Maybe once in a billion, but there's hundreds of billions of things, so it happens a lot. So they just fly apart. When they do, they have to conserve momentum. The momentum it had in the beginning has to be equal to the momentum it has afterwards. So now that means if it had zero momentum here, these two particles have to go off exactly opposite from each other so the total momentum still stays zero. You see, so the sum of the both is still zero.
How do they identify those particles? I heard about the teleportation where they have to entangle particles and then they can.
That's not it.
Another particle become entangled with something else that then the third party disappears.
You'll have to realize that all of these things are metaphors. They talk about them as you have particles, and particles are entangled, and they do all sorts of things. This is metaphorical. Stuff happens, and they make up an excuse for it. That's how science is done. None of these particles are real. There are no particles.
No, I understand that.
Yeah, there are no particles. Particles only are metaphors for things. The way science works, they look at results of things. You know, they see something that's an effect. That's it. They look at effects. So they see an effect, and then they say, well, that effect could be caused by this. So they make up a particle to explain the effect. They never see the particle. The particle is just a metaphor. It's just an imaginary thing they make up to explain this effect. That's how science works. So they'll have an effect, which is, let's say, the Millikan oil drop. Okay, it's an experiment that found that there was a single charge. Well, they have an experiment, and certain oil drops will go faster than others if they have an electrical field on them and so on. They figure out that there's this unit-based charge. Okay, so they call that then a unit charge. Turns out to be like an electron. The electron is just made up. The effect is real. Science only measures effects, just like we only get the data. We never see where the data comes from. Science only can measure effects. They never can actually measure the cause of the effect. They measure effects and they make something up out of whole cloth to explain it. And that becomes theory. And if the theory is good, then the theory lasts. But it doesn't mean the theory is right. It just means that is a made-up answer for that effect, you see? So particles don't really exist at all. That's why we get to quantum mechanics and have to throw out particles and say they're probability distributions. Probability distributions don't exist. There's not a little probability distribution that flies through the sky and decides which slit to go through. The probability distribution is just a metaphor. All of those things we're talking about is metaphors. An individuated unit of consciousness is a metaphor. The larger conscious system is a metaphor. These are all metaphors because if we don't make metaphors about things, we can't discuss it. We have to break it up into functions and pieces so that we can talk about it. But once we then imbue the pieces that we've made so we can talk about it, we start believing our own models. We start believing that particles actually exist. They don't. Quantum mechanics says, there's no particle, it's just probability distribution. And if you make a measurement, there's a certain probability you'll find something. It's just that simple. Particles don't exist, it's just probability that things are places. Well, that's because this is a probabilistic model, not a deterministic model. It's a top-down probability simulation, not a bottoms-up deterministic simulation.
Well, that we, I think, had an inner body experience, which would be an ID.
Okay, where are we with time?
One last question. Is this gentleman here?
One last question.
What is your take on mind-altering drugs such as hallucinogens? Do you think that these could be instrumental in the development of our consciousness?
Could they be? Possibly. I've run into a few people who seem to have very positive results in their development from drugs, but they all fall into one category. They tried some drugs. The drugs showed them that it's a bigger reality. They let the drugs alone and went to try to, went to the internet or someplace to figure out what was going on and how it worked. And from then on, they're drug-free, they learn, they grow, they develop their consciousness and so on. So as an initial wake-up call to show you that there is this bigger reality, it seems to work okay. Anything beyond that, generally not so much. The reason is, you don't grow up from an experience. You don't have an experience and grow up. You grow up because you change yourself. You're different. You have to change who you are. And the only way to grow up is to let go of your fear. Having an experience doesn't help you that much to let go of your fear. It may help you a little bit to let go of some fears, but it's not going to reduce your ego, get rid of your beliefs. It'll change your beliefs, mostly. Changes your beliefs and modifies your ego into some other thing. The problem I found with people who do drugs regularly is that they tend to have the opinion that they have evolved spiritually. Just like drunks have the opinion that they're brilliant. They've seen things. They've seen big pictures. They've seen things. They've been a part. They've experienced being a part of the whole. They've experienced the oneness. They've experienced some magnificent things, and it changes their life, and they see things differently now than they ever did before. But it doesn't really make much fear go away. What they've gained is mostly up here in experience. What they need to do is change down here at the being level to become somebody else. And those two don't, one doesn't make the other happen. Now, it's not that, it's not that it can't happen, but generally in our culture, the way we do drugs is that it's illegal. We do them in a privacy, someplace, with friends. That's not a very controlled way of doing it. If we were to actually study these drugs and find out how and why they work and what they do and how they could be used maybe in a controlled way, in a very well-defined program or something, maybe they could turn out to be useful. But just taking a drug to have an experience and going, wow, that was a great experience, now I understand everything now, and then going back to your life and basically living it the same way you did before isn't all that helpful. But because you think you understand it so much better now, and you've seen a bigger picture, which is true, it's a true picture that you see. It's not that all that's just a meaningless hallucination. Those drugs will enable you to see real reality, the way it is. But now that you've seen it, it will change something about your attitude. Oh, you've got this bigger picture now, and look at all those people. They've never had that experience. They don't understand. They don't know that we're all connected. They don't know that we're all part of the same big thing. They've never felt the love of what they might call the universe, but it isn't, of consciousness. And because of that, they feel kind of different and special. They tend to stay off to themselves. They tend to lose interest in this mindless rat race that makes up the larger society and all its nastiness. So they tend to withdraw. And all of that's counterproductive. Where your growth comes from is from interacting, engaging, not withdrawing. You got to connect. You got to deal with that nasty system and deal with it with love and with caring and not with ego and not with belief. So withdrawing is the wrong way to go. Engaging is the way to go. But if you feel like you are enlightened and you've learned a whole lot and you tend to withdraw from that nasty world that just doesn't understand, those things may be true. You may have learned a lot about it, and that world is pretty nasty. But that's not on your path to love. That's on your path to self-congratulations, because you know so much more than everybody else. You've had these wonderful experiences. Those poor slobs just don't get it, and you're going to rise above them, and you're really not on their level anymore, and they'll just have to go, wallow in their own misery, because you're not part of that scene anymore. And you're shifting your ego from where it was to now a different sort of ego. And it's not really growing up. It's change. It's different. But it's, I've known dozens of people that have done that. And I've met them in a lot of talks. They come up and they talk with me. And it's usually clear that they're still right up here with fear and ego. They've had amazing experiences, of course, but they're still right up to here with fear and ego. So they're not really growing up as much as they think. They just have seen a bigger picture. It's like you travel. You know, go back 300 years, travel was really hard. The only people who traveled were rich people because it was so hard. And rich people would go and they would have a bigger perspective. And now they weren't so provincial anymore. Everybody else never got more than 20 miles from home because 20 miles is a long walk. So these people who traveled had bigger viewpoints, bigger perspectives. But did it make them nicer people? Did it grow them up? Did it make them more loving and more caring and whatever? No. It made them cleverer. It made them bigger. Yeah, they could see things. Made it easier for them to manipulate things on a bigger level. It did help them. They did grow from it, but they didn't evolve the quality of their consciousness very much just by seeing things. Experience isn't the thing. All right, my boss back there is about ready to shoot me. So we're going to have to wind this up. I'd just like to say thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Okay, ladies and
I'd like to be able to
Tom
stay
Campbell,
longer.
round of
Thank you. Thank you.